У нас дуже компетентна
We have a very competent
компетентний склад учасників. Я представлю
panelists. I'll
кожного з них.
introduce each of them.
По-перше, у нас голова
First of
Фонду
all,
державного майна
We
Віталій
have
Трубаров.
Vitaliy Trubarov, acting head of the State Property Fund of Ukraine. He's the main person who's responsible for the privatization in the country. We've got the
від фракції «Самопоміч» Тетяна
MP
Острікова.
from Samopomich, Tetiana
У
Ostrikova.
нас заступник
We have the deputy
виконавчого директора МВФ
of the
Влад Рашкован.
alternate executive director of IMF, Vladyslav
І у нас
Rashkovan.
радники з двох,
And we have
напевно,
advisors
найбільших
from
підприємств, які
two
зараз
biggest
знаходяться
enterprises
у
which
черзі на
can be,
приватизацію.
which should be
У нас
privatized
Piotr
soon.
Piela,
That's Mr. Piotr Piela,
партнер
who's a partner in Ernst & Young
польського, які є
Polish,
радниками.
who is a business advisory,
А також Rebwar
and
Berzinji,
Rebwar Berzinji,
який є,
who
який
is
очолює консорціум
the head of the consortium
радників
of
по
advisors
Одеському припортовому заводу.
on the Odessa port factory.
Я відразу починаю з інтерактивного запитання. Прошу вивести на
I
екран.
will at once begin with the interactive
Ми
question.
подивимося, що аудиторія
Let us look
думає на цю
what
тему.
the
Ви
audience
можете
thinks about
зісканувати
that.
цей
You
код
can scan
зі
this
свого
code
телефону або
from
зайти на
your
сайт
phone or to
menti.com.
visit the website mentin.com.
І коли ви зайдете на цей сайт,
And
то треба
when you
ввести
visit this
код
website, you have
704-143.
to input the figure 704143. 704143.
Отже,
So,
запитання у вас на екрані.
the question is on your screen of your gadget or cell
Я
phone.
перекладу.
I will translate it.
Чи українська приватизація вже
Whether-
зрушила з
if-
мертвої точки?
Ukrainian has already
Варіант
begun
відповіді так.
its movement from a standstill.
Важко сказати.
The answers are yes,
Прошу
no,
голосувати.
or difficult to say. So please vote.
Код 704-143.
The code is 704
704-143.
143.
Для тих, хто щойно зайшов,
For the people who just joined us,
ми
We are
починаємо з
beginning
інтерактивного
with an
голосування.
interactive
Наше
survey of
запитання
polling. Our question is,
треба зайти на веб-сайт
well, at first you need
menti.com
to visit the
або
website
зісканувати цей
menti.com
код,
or to
який ви
scan this
бачите на
QR
екрані,
code you can see on the screen
і ввести
and to input
цифри
the figures
704-143.
704143.
Я трохи зачекаю, поки
I will wait a bit for
люди, які щойно
the people who
приєдналися
have
до
joined
панелі,
us
проголосують, бо в нас
to vote because
статистично
we
ненадійні
have
результати.
the statistically irrelevant results then.
Всім вдалося зайти на
So did
на
everyone
веб-сайт?
manage to visit this website?
Окей. menti.com або зісканувати код,
Menti.com or
який
just
зараз
scan the
вивели на
QR
екран.
code you can see on the screen.
Можна вивести результати?
So can we show the results, please?
Отже,
So,
очевидно, що
It's
абсолютна
obvious
більшість
that the
людей
absolute
у цій
majority of
аудиторії
the people present here
вважає, що
consider that Ukrainian privatization so far has never moved from a standstill. So now I'm giving the floor to our participants of the discussion. Let's begin with the head of the State Property Fund. Would you comment upon this result? First of all, I'd like to greet all of you here in this rather cozy place, and I would like to thank the organizers of this event for the forum which is taking place here. Unfortunately, the previous panel was a bit too long, so I do hope that, that's why we don't have the full house here, but I still hope that people will join us later. So the question which I heard in the beginning of this discussion, well, it's now a kind of rhetorical one. Maybe after the end of this discussion, lots of the people could be able to answer differently. In my opinion, the society, well, everybody is exhausted of discussions of the questions about privatization itself, not only issues. And during the recent years, there have been lots of things said and discussed, and I'm always facing the people who are saying, "You are speaking about privatization so much. When will it finally begin?" Everybody is waiting for beautiful sales, beautiful stories of privatization. Everybody is speaking about the one enterprise, which is Krivorozhstal, and after this event, in fact, here we cannot boast with anything at all. I think that during today's discussion, we need to speak about and discuss the issues of privatization as a global issue in the economic sector. We'll speak about important points and the main points in privatization. And maybe also we should mention that important points shouldn't interfere in the implementation of the main points. So what's the main then? The main point in privatization is the course, the direction along which we are heading for, the basis we are having as a foundation, which will allow us to answer the question, why do we do that? What the result we want to gain? Whether this result is satisfactory from the point of view of understanding of our internal economic community, whether it's perceived in a good way beyond the borders of our country, whether our work, our teamwork is important of both of the state fund property and the cabinet of ministers of Ukraine, the presidential administration, the parliament, will it ever lead to the result which we are all expecting for? And then the society and lots of the presentees here would be able to re-estimate the process which we used to have before and to look boldly into the future. And those forecasts which will be done, we will explain why, how, and for what, and when, and which result will gain. What's the main point and the basis, the foundation? We had a long way to understand what needs to be done to reformat the process of the privatization. And with the common efforts, we came to the conclusion that we need to change the rules of the game. We need to unify the legislation framework, to have it correspondent with the understanding which the whole world got used to, what the open, transparent, honest privatization is, which was, in fact, done beginning with the last year, and in autumn last year, the new law on privatization has already come to the parliament, but unfortunately it was adopted only in January this year. In March, the president has signed it. Closer to May, together with the cabinet of ministers of Ukraine, we prepared the whole legislation framework for this law to work, and on the 10th of May it was adopted. So only to July we finally began to deal with the issue that we can begin this privatization directly, in fact. But the time we lost with this natural course of events, we lost this time to perform those planned obligations and commitments we took. But we did not lose time, in fact, because this time was wasted to form the course, the proper course, which will lead us to get this success of sales, successful privatization, when both external and internal investor in the practice will be convinced that the state has a fair play, that the state is ready to openly show the assets which it has for the privatization and to have the fair policy with the investors. In my opinion, we had the first point of no return, defining this legislation field, which tells us that now privatization will be fair. The new law, which decreases the terms, which gives the guarantees for the investors, which provides the preparatory stage at the very high judicial and economic level, and gives an opportunity both to the advisories whom we engage for the big privatization and new investors to come to us, to buy our big and small enterprises, to bring investments there, and to help develop the economy. Maybe my thesis is a bit debatable, but privatization for today maybe is the only way to attract huge investments into our country. Maybe it's a complicated one, maybe it's not that comprehensible, but still it's the only one. So I think that we need to consolidate around this process and to develop it further on, to deepen the issues of privatization and the work of the fund itself, and cooperation of the fund with other state branches of power, for this process to be comprehensible and needed by the society. Well, maybe I took a bit too much of time, yes? No, not because of that. I wanted to tell that we know that the law is incredibly important, but for the reader of news, a usual person, it's not a tangible result. So I'd like to give the floor to Vlad now, for him as a person from beyond to estimate it. I personally see several results. For instance, here we have two advisors on the stage, and it means that there are certain movements in the preparation of privatization of the certain objects, and there are other advisors around. So another important result is that I don't know statistics, but approximately 100 of auctions as for small privatization have already taken place. And also the fact that the Cabinet of Ministers has adopted the decree on the Center Energo, where they created the schedule and they plan the sales this year. This is already the result, which is understandable. But what does Vlad think about that? A man from beyond. I was never offended like that before, especially in my own city, and especially when IMF said too many requirements for the privatization in this program. But I would like to separate, to bisect this question. The first part of this question is that in 2000 till 2005, I've been a teacher here in Odessa, so I cooperated with the creators of Kyiv School of Economy, and it had the name of Economic Research Consortium. And in 2012 and 14, I've been the member of the board, so I do remember lots of statistically significant research which estimated the privatization of the 90s, and we were speaking about thousands of enterprises. The conclusion was very simple. I do remember that students were so excited to get the data of the activities of these companies which have been privatized, and the conclusion was very simple. After several years, 2 or 3 years after privatization, since the middle of the 90s, the state companies which have been privatized were working much better than the state ones. Secondly, the enterprises which were privatized with the help of the foreign investors, they were working again better than those which were privatized by the local owners. And as I am still a big fan of Kyiv School of Economy, I asked the State Property Fund to give more statistical data for the future students, for the researchers, for them to analyze that and to work upon that, because we need at least 1,000 new cases to analyze the efficiency of the enterprises and to prove that privatization is profitable, as we believe in that. Vlad, Central of Economic Strategy wrote such a paper. They found statistically important difference. So this data already exists. Yes, but we still focus upon the 90s because we didn't have a single big privatization for the last 14 years. And the second part of your question, because you have the wrong formulation of the question. I'm sorry, of course. Because the question in the name to sell or not to sell, it seems to me we should sell. But the question is what should be sold. My answer, everything should be sold.
Как продавать все, надо было
Just
бы
to
поставить
sell
в качестве заглавия этой темы.
That's what we should. That's how we should name this
И
panel
для того, чтобы
discussion.
понимать, что продавать все, я предлагаю сделать
And
одно маленькое
for us to
упражнение. Я
understand
такое
how we
делал
sell everything, I advise you
5 июня
to
2014
conduct
года,
this
когда я работал в
exercise,
Нацбанке, у нас была встреча с
which has been
международными
done at the meeting with the foreign partners in the national bank. I asked all of the people to close their eyes and to imagine how the banking system will look like. Would you please close your eyes and imagine how the Ukrainian economy, Natasha, close your eyes, don't
Как
look.
будет выглядеть
How
наша
will Ukrainian economy look
экономика в
like
случае, если мы
in case if we
начнем приватизацию или
begin the
продолжим это
privatization
делать?
or go on
То
with
есть,
it?
первое, у нас не будет ни одного
We will
государственного
never
предприятия,
have
ни
a
одного.
single state
Не нужно
enterprise,
государственное
not a
предприятие.
single
Ни
one.
одно
We don't need
доказано,
it.
что государственное предприятие должно
It's
работать
proved
лучше.
that it
Кто
shouldn't
сказал, что
work?
нельзя
Who
приватизировать
said
украинскую
that
железную
we
дорогу?
shouldn't privatize the Ukrainian railways? Who said
Верховная Рада
that?
України.
Dzerzhinsky?
Дзержинский
The
сказал
parliament
это,
of
что это очень
Ukraine?
важно, это целая армия внутри
Dzerzhinsky
страны.
said that the whole
Нет,
army
если
should be
частные
inside
компании могут
the
работать
country. The
эффективнее,
private
они должны
companies
работать
could be
эффективнее. Хорошо, пошли
efficient. Of
дальше.
course, they
Кто
can be
сказал, что
efficiently.
таможни
Who
должны быть
said that the
государственными?
customs has to
Есть
be
кейсы, которые
state ones?
подтверждают,
There are cases
есть
which
кейсы,
prove
которые подтверждают, что таможни
that the
могут быть
customs
частные и работать
can be private
неэффективнее.
and
Кто
work
сказал, что
more
больницы должны быть
efficiently. Who said that the
государственными?
hospitals
Кто
should
сказал,
be
что
state
садики,
ones,
школы должны быть
state-owned? Who said that the
университеты
schools
должны
and
быть
kindergartens and
государственными? Кто сказал,
universities should be
что
state-owned? Who
государство
said
должно
that
выдавать
the
справки?
state needs to give
Почему это не может делать
certificates?
частная
Why
компания?
can't it be
Паспорта
done
может
by the
выдавать, если
private
у нее есть
companies?
доступ
It
к
can even issue
государственным реестрам,
passports
если
if
есть
it has
разрешение,
access to
система,
the
которая
state
работает.
registers, if there
Государство
are
как бы
certain
должно заниматься тем, чем оно
permits and
занимается
licenses.
по
The state
функции
should
обороны,
do its
в
own
данном случае
functions,
правопорядка в
security,
стране. Все
law,
остальные функции должны быть отданы
enforcement.
в частные руки.
All of the
Больницы в
rest of
районах могут
functions
также
should be given to
обслуживаться
the
частными
private
компаниями.
hands.
Для этого
The
не нужно
hospitals can be
государство. Не
served
надо
by the
говорить о
private
социальной
companies. We don't
ответственности,
need
о
the
том,
state.
что
We shouldn't speak about
государство
social
это делает
responsibility, that the
для
state
того,
is
чтобы
doing
помочь
that
там
to
бедным
help
людям, у которых нет
poor
денег
people who
в
don't have
регионах.
enough of
Есть
money in the
страховки, которыми
regions.
это
But we
можно
have
заместить.
insurance.
Есть частные компании, есть
There
много
are
стран даже
private
в Европе, где
companies
это
and
сегодня
lots of countries
делается.
in
Поэтому
Europe
вопрос
who
заключается,
practice that.
нам
So
нужно
the question
переходить
is
от
that
идеи,
we
что нам нужен
need
закон,
to have a
который
transition
нужен
period.
действительно
That
того,
is
что
that we
нужны
need
процедуры,
the
которые
law, we need the
нужны нам.
procedures,
Но нам нужно гораздо
but we need,
подойти
in
к этому
fact,
более смело, то, как
to
делали,
be
если
much
честно,
more
в середине
brave,
90-х,
as it
ну и в
was
том
done
числе
in the
дать
middle of the
повод для
90s,
студентов больше анализировать.
and to give more reasons for the students to analyze. Thank you.
Можно я сразу...
Замечтались?
So you dreamt too much. You can open your eyes
У
finally.
каждого свои мечты, наверное, да? в
Well,
экономике.
everybody has his own dreams, I guess. So
Ну, сразу захотелось прокомментировать.
I would like to
Ну,
comment upon that
во-первых,
instantly. And
стучите,
first
и
of
вам
all,
откроется,
you should
поэтому,
knock in the
ну, я не
door,
помню
and the door will be opened
обращений
then.
к
I do not
ИП.
remember any applications to get the statistical data. We are
готовы
totally open. We are ready to give out any data for everyone who files a request. Secondly,
Согласен с вашим
I
тезисом
agree
по
with your
поводу того,
thesis
что
that
продавать надо все.
we should sell everything.
Но с маленькой
But
оговоркой, я
with
думаю,
a
что
small
всё-таки
remark.
государство
I think that the
минимум на
state,
какой-то
at
там
least for a
краткосрочный
certain
или
short-term or
среднесрочный
medium period
всё равно
time,
должно оставить,
should
своей
still leave
100%
under its
собственности
100%
активы,
property the
которые
assets
обеспечивают
which
её
provide
какую-то безопасность,
its
да,
security,
экологическую,
ecological,
атомную,
economic,
да,
nuclear,
какие-то вещи,
some other things,
которые
which
идут на помощь. Всё остальное должно
can
быть
help in
подлежать
this
или целям
sphere. All of the
приватизации, или
rest should
целям
be either
концессии,
under
как
the
одной
aims
из
of
форм
concession
привлечения инвестиций.
or privatization.
Соответственно,
Concession
если
is
мы
one of the forms to
ставим,
attract investments.
жирную точку
So
над
if we
тезисом,
have
что
the
всё
full
нужно
point,
продавать, мы говорим о
full
том,
stop,
что нужно
that
теперь
everything should be
поставить
sold,
вопрос, как мы должны
then we
это
should ask
продавать.
how it should
И,
be
соответственно,
sold.
тот закон, который у нас
And
есть,
the
он и
law we are
отвечает
having
на эти
now
вопросы.
answers all of
Что
those
вся
questions,
государственная
that
собственность
all
разбита
of
на
the
два
state
больших-
property
на
is
две большие
divided
группы,
into two big
объекты малой
groups,
приватизации,
the objects of
объекты
the small
большой
privatizations
приватизации.
and big
И теперь мы
privatizations.
просто
And
должны поставить
now we
сроки,
just
за
need
какой
to
период времени мы
define the
должны
terms
пройти
during
этот
which
путь.
time we are
Малая приватизация,
overcoming
вот
this way.
напомню
As for the
небольшую
small
статистику,
privatization, I
все
can
те
remind
объекты,
you
которые идут
statistics. Those
по
are the
сумме своих
objects
активов до 250
which
миллионов
are
гривен.
altogether
И
cost
они
not more than
продаются исключительно на
250 million
электронных
hryvnia,
аукционах.
and they're sold
И большая
only at the
приватизация,
e-auctions. And the
которая
big
превышает эту сумму,
privatization,
там, где у
which
государства есть контроль
is
над
higher
покупкой
than this
акций,
sum,
она
where
идет с
the
привлечением
state has the
советников
control
компаний,
package
которые
of
государство
shares.
нанимает для того, чтобы
Then it's done
помочь
with the advisors,
приватизировать
which are
эти активы
hired
по тем
by the
правилам,
state to
которые
help to
привык
privatize
работать
those
весь мир.
assets according to
Что
the
мы
rules
сейчас сделали?
which the whole
То есть то
world
моё
uses.
выступление,
That's what
которое
we've
было, оно
done.
привело
So
к
my
чему? Что мы
introductory speech speech.
готовили базис
was saying the same. We've prepared the foundation according to which we are moving forward. But how and how quickly we are moving on, how quality will do that, it will depend on our teamwork with all of our counter-engines, including the foreign partners. I can see you, but I think that my question is, what should be sold? It would be asked to a member of parliament. And now, well, you think that the parliament knows better what should be sold? Well, parliament still decides. But we will discuss it. I don't want this discussion. I don't want to monopolize this discussion. I'd like to give the floor to Piotr.
How would you take stock of the Ukrainian privatization? Has it moved from a standstill or not?
Well, thank you. I don't know whether I'm the best person to comment on the privatization itself. We are supporting the fund in the privatization process of Centrenergo, which is the combined group of electric power coal-fired units, really. At the positive side, we are on schedule. Already approached pretty wide group of potential investors. Many of them expressed initial interest. That's good. And now, when you look at the timing, it is not the most fortunate. Even if you put Donbas and other things aside, privatization of Centrenergo goes together with quite big transformation of the market, which is quite a unique situation. Primary legislation is in place, true. The secondary one, which is by far more important, is still under construction, still being discussed, so we are waiting for the final shape of secondary legislation. Still, there is very little clarity on how the future market will look like, the one which will come with the 1st of July of 2019. We may know the rules of a game, like football, we never know the outcome. So we do not know how the players would behave on the open market and what actually electric power price can be expected. And this translates to the number of questions which are being raised by potential investors. Okay, what are we willing to buy? Thinking of privatization itself, of the process of Centrenergo, of course it is too early and we cannot disclose the name of potential investors. The transaction itself is considered kind of unattractive. And why? There are a few reasons. At the one hand, Ukrainian economy is growing and it is expected that in the same time the consumption of electric power will grow. So there are prospects. When you look at the developing market, which is not that transparent today, this brings a lot of threats, but in the same time, quite many opportunities, especially for a player who is experienced and is having skills to benefit from not transparent from the developing market. And the skill, which is crucial to operate on the new market, is energy trading. It is not a job, it is a skill which will not come overnight. And it can be a game changer. It is being recognized by many of investors. Okay, it can be an opportunity to start our journey on the Ukrainian energy sector. When you look at the Ukrainian system and generation mix and location in the system, being between the, let's say, ex-Soviet countries and European Union, it can be utilized as a hub to start export of electric power, which was not explored yet. It is a great value. And last but not least, it can be a very good place to introduce and deploy technology. Yesterday, we've learned about the big modernization need of electric power sector of Ukraine. There are plenty of technology providers who are looking carefully at Ukrainian market and sector, thinking which technology can be deployed. And even if they will start the presence on the Ukrainian market with the generation assets, which is Centrenergo, nothing will stop them to introduce technology for transition or distribution of electric power or renewables. It is just a starting point. So as of today, I'm quite optimistic looking at the process. As I've said, we're on schedule. We hope to accomplish the whole privatization till the end of the year. The biggest question mark, which I believe will be raised later on, is the starting price, which is really an issue from the whole process perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Piotr. Rebwar, do you see any movement from a standstill? And what is your take on the perspectives of OPZ?
First of all, I want to thank ICU for a world-class event. This was very useful for us. We are new to Ukraine. We are based out of New York. We focus on mostly difficult distress or stress transactions. I saw the bar and I saw the results, and I guess from our perspective, we started our involvement around April, May. We were invited by the government not to really bid on the privatization, but more as a way of sort of advising them on what went wrong potentially and how we can do this better. And so, from my perspective, the way I judge the process is in two ways. One is the process itself, and then the goals that they're trying to achieve. And we've been very surprised and highly encouraged by how the government has reacted and how the State Property Fund has reacted, in that they invited us in May, along with two other advisors, to talk about what is needed, and our view was very straightforward and direct, and we said you have to restructure some of the debt and clean up the balance sheet before you put this out in an auction out to the market. They took that advice, and I don't know if you've noticed, but in their request for a proposal for OPP, it was very slightly different than the others, and it did point to the fact that you need restructuring to clean up the balance sheet. So definitely kudos to both the Cabinet and State Property Fund for acknowledging that, taking the advice, moving forward. The auction process was relatively straightforward, very transparent. Again, we were highly encouraged when we saw that. We went into a very tough negotiating process and signed the contract. So from what we've seen so far, it's clear that the government is interested in, at least on the assets that have been put out on the auction in these rounds, that they're very serious. In terms of the prospects for OPP, obviously, it is not an easy asset to deal with. We've seen two auctions, but this is a situation that you do see in other jurisdictions. This is not it's not an unsolvable situation if you are able to deal with the liabilities, and it's very important that those liabilities are dealt with, because a buyer, when you throw it at an auction, is going to look at all these liabilities and risks. And generally speaking, there are two types of risks. One group that you can price and an investor will take on and reflect it in the valuation of the asset, and there are other liabilities that cannot be priced, and they will refuse to take it on no matter what you do. And so it's important that you shield the investor. So the other important thing about the privatization I really want to discuss is that a lot of times, especially in my interaction, a lot of times people just focus on the proceeds and the price. Privatization has multiple goals. One is obviously to get the best price and put it back into the treasury. But what's also important is the opportunity cost of keeping that asset. The loss that you incur is obviously a form of economic value that needs to be considered. So that's very important. And the third is obviously bringing foreign direct investment, not just capital. It's very important who the buyer is, and you need to bring in a buyer that can look at the long-term potential, bring best management practices, bring in new technology. So that's how I would, in terms of observers like yourself and outside, you should be judging these privatizations based on these three criteria.
Thank you, Rebwar. Tetiana,
Tetiana, could you, after listening to all of the speakers and seeing the results at the screen, what do you think? Do we have any progress or not? Good afternoon, everyone. Well, in fact, I'm the person from beyond, as you said, so I'm the reader of the news, because here should be not me, but Maxim Nefedov, who knows privatization much better than I do. That is why I will assess according to the estimations of the people whom I represent in the parliament. So answering your question whether the privatization began its movement from a standstill, I would look at the figures. Look, 2015, 16 and 17, and by the way, in the budget draft for 2019, we have the same figure, that is 17.1 billion hryvnia. How much did we collect? 2015, 151, 16, 179, 17th year, 3.4 billion. 2018, the budget meant 21.3 billion and collected during the 7 months. Maybe the head of the fund has some objective information. 50 million were collected. So, in fact, it has moved, but only at the expense of the small privatization. As for those 3.4 billions which were collected to the budget during 2017, that is, first of all, the sales of the 25% of shares of Pendatech Dnipro-Oblenergo, DTEK Dnipro-Energo, PAT Kyivenergo, DTEK Zachidenergo, and DTEK Donetsk-Oblenergo. So it tells us how the privatization is going on in Ukraine. I just noticed when I said the question it was collected to the budget, I was even myself mistaken, because this was a logical mistake. Because our authorities, and not only our authorities, but in other countries, we want to get only fiscal effect, so just to collect money and temporarily to try to fill the fiscal gap. But in fact, this is the main mistake, that privatization cannot have fiscal effect. We cannot just say that I will sell my assets for this sum of money to gather this sum to the budget. First of all, as a state, we should look at what we are selling, whom we are selling it to, and the main thing, under which investment commitments we sell that. If we are in Odessa, I will just name a couple of examples. For instance, as for Chornomorsk port, we have a potential investor, a Chinese company, and I have different trade unions about the sum of the investment commitments is very small. During the 5 years to invest only $5 million, if I'm not mistaken. I'm apologizing, it's just ridiculous. And secondly, there are not a single guarantees to provide the rights of the collective, of the staff. When I'm reading today certain research which are ordered by our government to implement concession or PPP in the Yuzhny port, in this report I literally read in the chapter risks that the risk is the too big staff or personnel of the enterprise. The risk is the land issues. Those are land lots which are not registered. The risk is the insufficient or non-satisfactory legislation about the berths and waters. So what am I speaking about? The privatization itself, even under the perfect law, and the one which has been adopted is good enough, but not perfect, the privatization cannot move on its own without the changes in all of the other spheres of public governance and social life. If we have an insufficient land legislation and we don't have an efficient protection of the property rights and court, and the main thing, as for the counter-argument to my colleague Mr. Rashkovan, we don't have the antitrust legislation, which would really be acting. We are moving closer to this question, but while you're speaking, would you please show the second question for the survey on the screen? So if we don't have any of those components, privatization cannot move on a full scale. Out of the examples which I mentioned, you do understand Oblenergo and who bought all those shares packages. If we should sell everything, I cannot agree with that, with my colleague Rashkovan, because I will just name you one example. In Ukraine, the owner of Kyivenergo is, in fact, one beneficiary. Still, the similar American company has 800,000 owners of the shares. What does it give to Ukraine? What does it have as a consequence under the conditions when we don't have the acting anti-monopoly legislation? We have Kyiv residents here, and I'm sure you remember in 2014 we had certain electrical energy blackouts. I can see the Minister of Energy, so ago, he remembers, one person blackmailed the government with the blackouts. But as a member of the parliament, who has worked in the parliament for 4 years, coming from business, I can see that lots of my up-to-date colleagues came to the power just to use the resources of the state-owned enterprises, of the state budget. Sometimes it has the closed circle, because the state bank governs the political force, and certain audit services and even special departments of the national police, where the audit service sends its conclusions, is also controlled by this political force. We can see this kind of a closed circle, or the cycle, that when you are at power, you're using the state-owned enterprise resources and you enrich a lot. And also I can see here the ex-minister of agrarian policy, who's delegated by our political force, Alexei Pavlenko. I do remember how he used to lobby and to give for consideration to the parliament certain propositions to sell Ukrspirt and the state grain company. Those are the enterprises which are very bright examples of how it shouldn't be when the state is not an efficient owner. Undoubtedly, those enterprises have to be privatized. As for the critical infrastructure, in particular the railways, in particular what provides all of us with warmth, heat and light, with communications, dear friends, there are lots of questions about the necessity of the direct privatization under the conditions of the law enforcement and court environment, which is not working. Thank you, Tetiana. I think that we should come back to this issue, but before that, I'd like to measure the attitude of the audience. So let's look at the results of the first question. We don't say the result of the process. The second question had this kind of formulation. Taking into account the political context, could Ukraine have achieved more in terms of privatization during the past year? The figures you should input are 13453. 13453. So while the audience is voting, I'd like to give the mic back to Vitaliy. He definitely has what to say. Well, I'm working in the fund for a long time, so I can speak for hours about my work. No, please, we began the panel rather late, but we will have it late, of course, as the end will goes, but a bit quicker than it's written. So I was glad when I heard the words of Tetiana when she said that privatization is not a fiscal function. A couple of words about the State Property Fund of Ukraine as the central executive branch agency with a special status. We are the regulator of the several types of activities. We are the regulators of the rent relationship in our country. All of the state property is given to rent only through the fund and its structural departments. And recently we reported that in September we performed the task and we gave more than 1 billion of hryvnia to the budget, and now we want to increase this figure next year from the point of view of the increase of those contracts of rent we are awarding. The fund is a regulator of an assessment world, so-called, in Ukraine, and we are doing the training and certification of assessors, and we have the functions of the properties coming to the private property. I mean denationalization or destatization, but it's not a direct function of ours. If we have the sales, then we have new resources and funds. So any planned funds into the budgets are
планами, что будет,
so-called
если
plans what will
произойдут те или
happen
иные события. А если
if
не
certain
произойдут?
events happen.
А если не
But if
произойдут
they
из-за
don't
потому, что
take
ну, как бы
place,
там, ну, кто-то чего-то не
if those
хочет, а
events
что
don't take
объективно в
place because
экономике нет таких
objectively
факторов,
economy
которые бы к
doesn't
этому
contain the
приводили.
factors which would lead to
Самая
those
большая функция у
events.
приватизации,
Because
на
the
мой
biggest
взгляд,
function of privatization,
не
in my
поступление
opinion,
денег
is
от
not the
конкретных
money
продаж,
from the
а
precise
то, о чем говорили
sales,
наши
but what was
советники
mentioned
двух
by our
крупных предприятий,
advisors of the
что
two
самая
huge
важная
enterprises,
функция
that the
в
main
том,
function
что
is
будет происходить после
what
того,
will
как
happen
молоточек ударит
after
по столу и будет сказано
we'll
слово
finally
«продано».
hear the
Государству
word
более важно,
sold.
чтобы наши предприятия
It's
после
much more
продажи
important for the
работали,
state, for our
чтобы
enterprises to
люди на этих
function, to work,
предприятиях
for the
получали
people to
стабильную,
get
нормальную
stable and normal
европейскую
European
заработную плату,
salary at those
чтобы работающие
enterprises,
предприятия
for the working
выплачивали
enterprises to
налоги,
pay
а государство
taxes,
из этих
and the
налогов
state out
выполняло
of those
свои
taxes to
социальные
perform
функции,
their
которые у
social
нас есть.
functions which we
Вот
have.
это главная
This
задача
is
для
the main task
приватизации.
for the
Поэтому
privatization.
плановые задания
So
окей,
the
хорошо,
plan
их
task
можно
is
как бы там
okay, nice,
пересчитать,
it
их
can be
можно оспаривать,
recalculated,
их
it can
можно
be
прогнозировать там и так далее.
forecast and
Но, на
so
мой
on,
взгляд, это
but
все-таки
in
сумма
my
вторичная.
opinion, this
И
is the
выполнение
secondary
плановых или
functions.
невыполнение
And
плановых
plans or not
заданий
plans
на за последний период времени
during the
не
recent
говорит
period
о
of
том, что
time does
сам
not
фонд
tell
что-то там
us
не
that the
хочет
fund
делать. Мы
itself
говорим
does
о
not
том,
want to
что
do
сам
anything.
рынок не
It
готов
tells us
был
that the
к
market itself
активной
was not
приватизации,
ready for the
потому что
active
никто не
privatization
понимал,
because
как
nobody
это происходит
understood
и зачем.
how it happens
На
and
эти
why.
вопросы у нас не было никаких
We
ответов.
never had any
Теперь у
answers
нас на
about
эти
that.
вопросы есть
Now we
ответы.
have
Мы
answers about
определили
that.
новые правила
We
игры,
defined
они
the
всем
new rules of
понятны,
the
они
game, they are
абсолютно
understandable,
честны.
they're totally
И мы
fair.
приглашаем всех
So we
играть
invite
по этим
everyone to
правилам на
play
приватизационном
according to
поле.
those rules at
Для
the
того, чтобы
privatization field
улучшить общую
to
ситуацию в стране,
improve the overall
экономическую
situation in
ситуацию
the
в
country, I
стране.
mean the economic
И на
one.
вопросы, как бы там продавать,
And
не
as for the
продавать,
questions
я
whether it
все-таки,
should be
еще
sold
раз
or
подскажу,
not,
что
and
я считаю,
again,
что
I will tell
абсолютно
you that
необходимо продавать.
it's necessary
За
to
некоторым
sell.
маленьким исключением мы
With
должны
very
это
little
делать.
exceptions, we need to do that.
Спасибо,
About
Виталий. У
that.
нас есть тем временем результаты, и уже
We have the
желающие
results, and we
в зале
have the
прокомментировать.
people in the audience who want to
Мы
comment upon
посмотрим сначала
that.
результаты голосования.
So we will look at the result of
Тут
the
менее убедительная
voting.
картина, чем по первому
Well, this
вопросу.
is not as
Треть
convincing as for the
ответивших
first
считает,
question.
что все-таки ничего
One
нельзя
third
было
is
сделать
considered
больше,
that
но две
nothing
трети
could be
убеждены, что нужно
done,
было
but
сделать
two-thirds
больше
are
за
convinced that
последний год.
Ukraine could have achieved more
Я прошу
during
сразу
the
вывести
past
третий
year. And
вопрос
would you please
на
instantly
экран.
show the third question onto the screen?
Код 5033
The code is
77.
503377.
И вопрос звучит следующим
And the
образом.
question is the following.
Вопрос звучит так. Что нужно сделать для
What
того,
needs to
чтобы
be
ускорить
done
украинскую
to
приватизацию? И
speed
здесь,
up
возможно,
the
несколько
Ukrainian
вариантов
privatization?
ответов.
There are several options of answers.
Парламент должен сократить
The
список
parliament
предприятий,
has to
запрещенных
decrease the
приватизации.
list of the enterprises which
Необходимо
should be
реформировать фонд
privatized. We need to
госимущества.
reform the state property fund.
Приватизация
The
должна получить
privatization needs
толчок со
to
стороны
get the
президента.
push from the president,
Приватизация должна получить
Privatization needs
толчок со стороны
to get the
премьер-министра.
push from the prime minister.
И последний вариант — не надо ускорять
And the last
приватизацию.
option, we
Всё и
shouldn't
так
speed
хорошо.
up the privatization. Everything is okay without that.
Тем временем
Meanwhile,
бывший министр энергетики как раз хочет
the ex-minister
отреагировать
of
на
energy wants to react. So could I please add up to the dynamics of our discussion? I suggest to begin the discussion finally, because we had nice experts here in the audience, and they're just standing and sitting and not doing anything. So as for the discussion for the sales, there is no discussion. I totally support Ms. Ostrikova that we need to have a very cautious approach. Looks at the situation since 1991, all of the enterprises have become more and more cheaper. Do you agree with that? Yes, you do. Times and times cheaper. So if we do that, if we did it long ago, the situation would be totally different, both as for the environment and the corruption, which has begun because of the state-owned enterprises. As for the role of the fund, in fact, the fund has the function of not only selling, but governing. So if they had a trust with such huge resources, it seems to me this is the issue, this is the problem.
феноменальні підприємства
how
просто
phenomenal
розрушаються
enterprises
і
are
далі.
just
Тому щось
destructed.
робити потрібно. І,
So we need to do something.
Певно, не предмет дискусії зараз,
Well, maybe
але
it's not the subject
однозначно
of this
щось потрібно
discussion,
робити.
but definitely we need to do
Проблема
something
дійсно
with
в
that.
тому,
The
що є
problem
багато
is
людей
that
зацікавлених,
there are
які
lots
формують
of
думку експертів через експертів
interested
суспільства.
people with vested interested who form the
по якійсь
opinion of the
причині,
society
там,
and the experts. The
бореться
society
за те, щоб
itself is
не
fighting
не відкрити ринок
not
приватизації
to
землі,
open the
не
market of
відкрити
the land
приватизацію
privatization, not to
великих,
open the
якісних
privatization of
підприємств.
the
Я
big and
згідний, що є
high-quality enterprises.
політичні
I do
підприємства,
agree.
як, наприклад,
There are
ОПЗ,
political
тому що там,
enterprises.
крім проблем із
Because,
боргами,
for
ще є
instance, they
транзит,
have
і
not
є там
only
інші
debts and
додаткові
transit problems
складності.
and
Ціна
other
газу, яку ми
complications, the
ніяк
price,
на
the
неї
gas
не
price,
впливаємо,
and we
і,
do
ну,
not
тобто, і від
influence
неї суттєво залежить
on
і
it, and
вартість,
of
і
course
маржа,
the
і так далі.
price and the margin
В
depends
випадку
on
із
it a lot.
Центренерго
In the
є,
case of Centrenergo,
частина підприємства, яке знаходиться
the
майже
part
там
of
за
the
40
enterprise is
зони
40 kilometers
розграничення,
from the
відповідно,
delimitation zone,
є антрацит, якого в Україні
and we have
не
anthracite,
виробляють,
which
і
is not
маса
produced in
інших,
Ukraine.
Boytsun
There are
pills,
lots
які
of
вмонтовані
other
в це підприємство і фундаментально
Problems which are in
відлякують,
this enterprise, so they scare off
Але
the
є
companies.
насправді, наприклад, я для прикладу
in
скажу,
fact,
дивіться, приклад Криворіжсталі.
Криворіжсталь, that is the steel
висока
enterprise, is a
оцінка,
phenomenal
близька
example.
до ринкової,
A
ну,
very
можна
high
назвати
price, close to
ринковою.
the market one, or maybe it is the
Але
market one,
чому
but
це відбулося?
why did it happen?
Це відбулося тому, що
It
підприємство
happened
було не політичне.
because
Це
the
металургія.
enterprise was not
Зрозуміло,
political,
що на той момент
metallurgy,
відношення
because
до
it's
металургії
understandable
було
that the
скептичне,
attitude
всі
towards
думали, що
metallurgies were
всі
skeptical.
перейдуть на
Everybody thought that everybody would
електро-
use
стали,
electrical
ну,
and
тобто і треба
steel
модернізовувати, маса
machines.
так.
It needs to
У
be
випадку, кажу,
modernized.
із цим підприємством
In
маса
the case
політики. Тому,
of this
наприклад,
enterprise,
якби
there
ви
is
ставите на
lots of
приватизацію
politics. So,
якийсь
for
не
instance,
політичний
if
актив, типу,
certain
наприклад,
not political asset is given
Укргідро,
for privatization, for instance,
і не обов'язково
Ukrhydro,
цілий, можна,
and
по-перше,
maybe
його
not the whole
розділити, тому що
Ukrhydro,
там
it
є
can be
Дніпровський
divided
масив,
because we
є
have the
Дністровський,
Dnieper bulk, the
можна продати
Dniester
долю. Наприклад,
volume,
говорити, ми
so
завжди
you can
кажемо,
sell
от
the
хтось там
share.
прийде і буде управляти.
Sometimes we are saying someone
Чому?
will come
Якщо
and will
запропонувати
govern.
20%,
Why?
25%
If
долю,
we suggest
то, що робили
20% to
поляки?
25
Вони
share,
продавали
how
там
the
свої
Polish people did,
пульмоси, ці
they
спиртові заводи,
sold their
потрошки,
pulmos,
більш
the
активно. І таким чином сформували
alcohol
цілий ринок.
factories in
Потім
a more
ресурсну
active
базу
way.
для,
That's how they formed the whole
пенсійних
market. And then the
фондів.
resource
Тобто
base
вони
for the pension
фінансовий
funds.
сектор
The
таким чином
financial
зробили.
sector was
По-перше,
done like
забрали,
that.
корупцію, ну тобто мінімізували корупцію.
They
Смисл
minimize the
політикам
corruption.
займатися не політикою,
But what's
а
the point of
економікою,
the
чим
politicians to
вони
deal with
неприродно
economics but
займаються.
not politics?
І сформували
So they
величезний
formed
сегмент.
a huge segment.
Тому, колеги, мені
Dear
здається,
colleagues,
що
it seems to
питання
me
треба робити.
that the
І
question
сама основна
is
проблема,
that
як
we need to
переконати
do it as quickly as
виборців,
possible.
на
And
жаль,
the main problem is
виборців,
how to convince
в тому, що це
the
робити потрібно
voters
і не,
that it needs to be
там, скажімо,
done
стопорити
and not to be
там,
stopped
якимись
or
штучними
stagnated
заходами,
with certain
там,
artificial
з плакатами
measures,
перед
with
Верховною
certain
Радою,
slogans
із
in
сльозами
front
на
of the
очах,
parliament
і
and with
фразами,
tears
«Не
in your
продавайте
eyes,
наше багатство, наші,
and with the
там,
phrases do
перлини»
not
і так
sell
далі.
the pearls
Тому що
of
ми
our
їх просто
legacy
розрушаємо.
and so on, because we're just destructing them. Thank you. I will give you an opportunity to react, but I would like to say that, in my opinion,
приватизація Криворіжсталі набагато складніший кейс, тому що це була
the
реприватизація.
privatization of Kриворіжсталь is much more complicated because it was reprivatization. We had to take it and then to sell it.
Влад вже давно хоче
But Vlad wants
розказати,
to
як
tell
продати
us
це.
how to sell everything now.
Продолжить
I'd
диалог,
like
мне
to go
кажется,
on with this
мы
dialogue.
входим в очень... Мы излишне политизируем вопрос,
So we are
который
politicizing a bit too
достаточно
much the issue,
относительно
which is
технический. Ну,
too technical.
было сказано только что по поводу представителя парламента, было сказано о том, что есть
So just the
стратегические
member of the
отрасли,
parliament
которые
said
нам
there are
нельзя
certain
приватизировать.
strategic
Да,
branches
и
which
был
can't
определенный
be
список.
privatized,
Давайте
and we have
начнем
the
с
list
последней
of that.
цифры.
Let's begin with the
Было
last
сказано связь.
words.
2 недели
Communications.
назад была конференция
2
по
weeks ago, there
governance,
used to
и
be
проводили интересный,
conference on governance,
интересный
and there were interesting
чарт, график, где
charts
показывали,
and tables,
сколько была стоимость коррупции
which
в
showed
середине 90-х,
what was the
по-моему,
cost of
94
corruption
году.
in the
Знаете,
middle of the
сколько стоило
90s,
установить
in
телефон в среднем по
1994.
стране? Сколько
Do you
нужно
know
было заплатить,
how
чтобы установить
much you
телефон?
had to pay to
Ну,
set up
по-моему,
a
что $1040.
phone,
Вот
a
это стоило
telephone?
приблизительно $1000, чтобы получить линию телефона.
$1,000 to get a
Укртелеком это
telephone
была
line of
как бы
Ukrtelecom.
организация, одна из
Ukrtelecom was
самых,
one of the most
самые большие дачи были у руководителей
corrupted
Укртелекома.
organizations.
Так
They
вот,
had the biggest dachas, that is
сколько сейчас
country
стоит телефон
houses.
получить?
And how much does that phone cost now?
Выйдите, ну, 25 гривен.
Да,
25
пакет,
гривна.
телефона, и вам не нужна никакая фиксированная линия. Второй вопрос.
And
Никто
you
же не
don't need
задается
a
вопросом,
fixed line.
почему у нас по всей стране не стоят
And nobody
государственные
asks,
заправки.
Why don't we have the state fuel stations? Why do we fuel our cars and in the private stations and we don't need the state ones? Why do we consider the railway a very strategic object? But there are lots of countries like France and Germany where those railways are private and it's not strategic. Isn't it strategic for France?
Это как бы первая часть. Вторая, я здесь абсолютно согласен по поводу.
This is the first part. And I totally agree as for the role of the fund. Well, we know the results. So all of the functions which were listed by the head of the fund, I'm sure that it will change soon. Well, the speed is another point, but still, all of those functions, since the end of the 80s and beginning of the 90s, from the point of view of the concept, this is not a regulatory body. The state property fund should deal with the state property. It should not regulate the market. We have totally different tools for that. The state property fund has to get its wages and salaries and bonuses out of the efficiency of the governance of state property. Whether it sold the enterprise, and I totally agree this is not the fiscal part, but it was properly said that the effect of the privatization is in the alternative costs. We don't have the state agencies which approve the financial plans, and that's why corruption emerges. I don't agree that the task of the state property fund is the privatization leads to the investment obligations and commitments. No, we do not analyze. We do not have requirements for the private companies. You do not come to the private companies and you're saying you have to invest X money. This is the Soviet Union. This is the planning. The planning in the Soviet Union was done in this way. You have to produce this much. Odessa factory had the factory of plow manufacturing, and nobody needs it now. And they had so many plows and plowing irons, so they had just to give it as a metal. So the task is to have an opportunity to sell it. I totally agree. Maybe not for 100%, but 75% to 25%, and the state must efficiently govern those shares through the supervisory boards, through the representation of their interests in those organizations. But we shouldn't take those organizations in your own hands. Believe me, the role of the state property fund, and I'm sure it will happen later, it should change for the better governance. Don't have any additional obligations. Believe me, private companies will work better than the state-owned ones.
Yes, so, you know, it's very interesting to hear the back and forth, and obviously there's a lot of history. So what I would like to do is see if I can somewhat tie in and bring a U.S. perspective, not because I'm pro-U.S. but, you know, the U.S. has obviously gone through a much more of a capital markets and private sector approach. I fully agree that most assets should be privatized, but it has to be done properly. And so, just an example in the US, if you go to a FedEx office, it's a completely different experience than going to the post office, US Post Office. Going to the US Post Office is almost going back in time, in 50s, 60s. It's depressing, and you avoid it as much as you can. So, in general, governments are not really good at running enterprises. What we are seeing, and from the brief history we have here, is that at least the next wave of, or the current wave of privatizations, there's this unclogging that needs to happen. There are certain liabilities that are pushing down the assets, that are causing these assets to lose value over time. And it's a function of legacy, corruption process, and non-governance. And so this standstill that is happening because of these legacies is actually another form of corruption, in that people who want to use and abuse those assets continue to use it because these things are sort of clogged under these liabilities. So I think it's very important that there has to be at some point a process that allows you to restructure these liabilities. For instance, under Margaret Thatcher, Great Britain, when they went through their privatization, they didn't throw these things out right away on the block for sale. They did a restructuring of the pension, of the liabilities, and they made sure that the moment they put it on the block, that these assets survive under privatized hands and governance. So that's one thing. The question that you get a lot of times is that there are certain strategic industries that should stay with the hands of the government. Again, I would challenge that. And I would say, maybe this is controversial, had there been an open market in terms of natural gas supply in Ukraine in the past, I don't think you'd have been in the situation that you're in right now where you are struggling to find natural gas to come into the country. Look at the US. US went through this revolution of the shale revolution, the ability to extract natural gas in a different way, new technology. And we have more natural gas than we need, unfortunately. And now we're exporting. We're exporters into Mexico and so forth. So even quote-unquote strategic industries, which you always hear, which I would imagine 10, 20 years ago, that was considered a strategic industry, natural gas. If that had been open to the private sector, I don't think you would have been in the situation that you are today.
Thank you. Rebwar, Tetiana.
Tetiana, the results can be seen here. The biggest request is for the parliament. Answering your question whether lots of things could be done, I would say yes, it could be done. But maybe it's not the task of the parliament, but the task of the government, maybe the state property fund. As for the order and with the enterprises, including the enterprises which are represented at our panel with the advisors. If we take Odessa port plant, everybody knows why this enterprise cannot be privatized for so many years. I think everybody of the presentees knows, because this is an artificial debt. So the government should make everything in order here and to decide how this enterprise can get rid of this debt, or at least minimize this debt. Before the panel discussion, we had a conversation with an advisors which models exist in the world. For instance, the model of certain assets allocation which can be sold and balance, or at least the main part of those artificially created debts will be there, for the enterprise to be interesting for the investors. Not a single investor will come. If we speak about the OPP, my personal estimation is, I do remember when it was for privatization in 2009 for $540 million, and now its price was approximately 50, with the debt of gas approximately 10 billion. Which, of course, much bigger than its assets. My personal estimation that it costs plus minus more or less 400. Well, of course, the advisors know much better how to assess and how to sell. But of course, it could be done better. And I cannot help responding my colleagues' phrases. Look, the private railway. Yes, there are certain examples of the private railways which are undoubtedly successful, but let us look. As far as I remember, the IMF supported nationalization of Privatbank, because the person, the beneficiary owner, is a monopolist, and he began to blackmail the state, the government, the authorities, in different issues. And now just imagine that Ukrainian Railways is now in the hands of the same person. You don't need to imagine. This person has the airline, the national airline of Ukraine. So what? Well, just imagine that the same person would have the railways too. Privatbank was nationalized because of the fraud, not because of the blackmail. Under the conditions when our country does not have the anti-monopoly legislation working and there are huge private monopolies, which shouldn't give such people an opportunity to create monopolies and to increase it at the expense of the state property and critical infrastructure. This is not the right way to do it just now. Just for you to understand, I totally support private railways, of course. But I would say that in the tax law there is a doctrine of the smart cautiousness. So speaking about making order with the strategic assets, including Ukrainian railways, I would use this doctrine. Especially taking into account the aggressor and permanent attempts to colonize Ukrainian economy, including... Could I say two points more? I totally agree with one of your latest phrases about the anti-monopoly committee and the legislation. So it's totally, you're totally right, we need to work a lot in these spheres. So it seems to me Vox had a very nice analysis about the concentration level in the economy. I have the question, you've mentioned about the cautiousness already, and the State Property Fund said that we need to have this short term. So what do you mean about this short term? We have the 27th year of independence. So this discretion, awareness, or how long will it last? A year, 5 more, 27 years more? Because we had this process, and now we are wary enough, we are discreet enough, and now, well, I'm sorry, doctrine of the clever discretion is not about how long, it's about how. I'm giving the floor to the audience now, because we have very nice questions and comments from the audience, but please introduce yourself. Good afternoon. I've got 2 questions. One about to Peter, the second to Vitaliy, Piotr and Vitaliy. So, as far as I understand, lots of big energy giants are looking at Centrenergo, but still there is certain information that, well, because Centrenergo has the resource base, is coal, which is not just pure energy. So at the level of transnational corporations, they decided not to invest not to the pure energy. How do you estimate the chances of transnational corporations coming for the privatization of Centrenergo? And the second question is to Vitaliy about the small privatization. As far as we understand, lots of enterprises which are under the governance of the ministries and other line ministries, they don't do it well as for the privatization. Do you push this process in any way or not?
Shall we start with Piotr?
Okay, thank you for the question. Well, I should not disclose too much, but still to answer your question. Looking at Centrenergo itself, we are aware how complicated this process is. 3 power plants, 2 of them were supplied with the coal, which is not necessarily on the Ukrainian territory. Number of technical issues which can be overcome. Thinking of coal as a fuel, European electric power utilities are not the most friendly towards coal. It is because of a climate policy and decarbonization. And it is not only reason why I would not expect to see many of them attracted with Centrenergo as a process. Most of European utilities, as you know, are facing their own issues and troubles. And when you look at the whole generation system of Europe, 900 megawatt of power, 400 of that does not generate profits at all. So Europe is dealing with their own problems, and they stay where they are. In the same time, there are still countries and electric power utilities which use coal as a fuel, and from their perspective, it can be an attractive market. When you look at something which only electric power utilities can recognize, the fast development of renewable sources, they need to be balanced. We cannot store electric power in, let's say, sophisticated or productive way or scale now. So the renewables need to be supported by flexible electric power sources. It can be gas, which is not necessarily the best case for Ukraine, and it can be coal. And from that perspective, if you are having an understanding of the growing capacity of renewable sources which need to be balanced, it can be a very attractive asset for the player who know, and for the player who is having a long-term agenda, how to establish a strong position on Ukrainian market. There were attempts in the past how to utilize nuclear power to balance different things and to play with flexibility. We know it does not work, and we should not repeat the same exercise. So coal can be attracted for the coal-friendly utilities and for technology suppliers. That's it. You should not expect too many European brands knocking Ukrainian doors and willing to establish coal-fired operations here. Still, that can be solved.
Okay, thank you. Был вопрос к Виталию.
There was the question from Vitaliy, how do you push
Отвечая на этот
the
вопрос,
ministries?
я
Answering
хочу
this question,
немножечко расширить
I want to
и еще раз
expand it
обозначить и
and to
развеять
tell
миф.
you again, or maybe dismantle the myth,
Государственное
bust the myth.
имущество Украины
The state
не
property of
принадлежит
Ukraine
фонду
does not belong
государственного
to the state
имущества
property fund.
Украины. Все государственные
All of the
предприятия
state-owned
распределены по
enterprises are
отраслевому
distributed
признаку и
according to the
управляются профильными
branches,
министерствами.
and it is governed
У
by
Фонда
the line
государственного имущества
ministries. The
Украины
state
есть
property fund
некоторая
of Ukraine
функция
has a
управления
certain
активов
function of
только
the
на
governance
период
only for the
предприватизационной
period which is
подготовки.
before the
И
privatization,
отвечая
the
на вопрос, кстати,
preparation. So
почему
answering
мы
the
там
question
не так
why
много продаем этих
we are
объектов,
not
потому что
selling
нам
those
эти
objects that
объекты не
much because
передают
we are
на
not
цели приватизации.
those objects are
Соответственно,
not
мы не
given to
можем
us
продать
for
то, чего у нас
privatization. We
нет.
cannot sell what we don't have.
То, что мы боремся
And
с профильными
the thing that
министерствами,
we are fighting with the
вот этой
line
административной
ministries,
машиной в Кабмине на
with this
предмет того, что,
administrative
ну
machine
окей,
in the
мы
cabinet
готовы
of
работать, мы
ministers,
готовы
we are ready to
трансформироваться, мы
work, we
готовы
are ready
делать
to
все, что
transform, we are ready to
нужно
do
будет для того,
whatever is
чтобы достичь
needed
конечной
to
цели.
achieve the
Только же
end
давайте эту
target,
ответственность или
but
эту
let
работу
us take this
распределять среди
responsibility
всех
and
участников
distribute
процесса.
it between all of the
Если
participants of the
Министерство
process. If
сельского
the Ministry
хозяйства,
of
как и Министерство
Agriculture,
экономики, как и
as well as
другие
the Ministry of
министерства,
Economic Development
делают
and
все
other
невозможное
ministries do
для того,
everything
чтобы
possible
чтобы не
and
передавать
impossible
под очень
not to
благовидными
give,
предлогами активы
any
от себя
assets
к нам.
to
Мы
us.
тут, я
We
извиняюсь,
cannot do
пальцы в
anything.
двери мы им не зажмем, да,
We
мы не
will
заставим,
not
если
torture
человек не
them.
хочет,
We
мы не
will not
заставим это
make
сделать.
them.
Поэтому
to do
необходимо
that.
как раз вот и
That is why we need this consolidation.
И это как раз то, о чем я говорил
And
в самом
this is
начале.
what
Вот
I
это как
said
раз
in the
является
very beginning.
важным
This is an
процессом. То
important
есть главным
process.
есть основа,
So the
а
main
важным
thing is the
является
foundation, but the
насыщение этой основы
important thing
практическими действиями.
is
И
the
практические
filling
действия
those
являются то,
gaps
чтобы
with practical
скорейшая
actions.
передача
The
этих
practical action
активов под
is
цели
to transfer
приватизации. Тем
those
более, что
assets
само
for the
политическое
privatization,
решение,
because the political
организационное
decision,
решение приватизации
organizational
активов уже
decision
принято.
of the assets
И
is
мы
already
топчемся на
taken.
месте, мы не
And we are
можем
just
двигаться
at the
дальше,
same
потому
place.
что
We cannot
физически
move
нам
on
эти
because
активы не
physically
передаются.
we never saw those
Спасибо.
assets.
А он открытый. Еще когда у нас существовала
It's
271-я
open because
постанова
when we
Кабмина,
had the decree
принятая с
271 of the
2015
Cabinet
года,
of
мы
Ministers,
все
which was
время
adopted in
и в средствах массовой
2015,
информации,
in
и в
the media
обращениях и в
and in
Кабмин,
the
и в Раду,
applications
на
and the
спецконтрольную
announcements
комиссию по
and for the
приватизации, в
special commission
администрацию.
on
Мы все это делали,
privatization,
когда
we
президент
always
проводил
wrote
Раду
that. And when the
реформ,
president held
посвященную
the
приватизации, мы об этом
council
говорили.
devoted to
Мы
privatization, we
открыты,
always
мы не
spoke
скрываем
about
этот
that.
цвет. Мы
We are
говорим, не
open, we are
передают.
never concealing.
У
And they
них спрашивают,
give
ребят,
it
вы
to
что не
us. They
передаете?
were asked,
Ну, мы сейчас
why don't you
передадим.
give?
Ну, видишь,
We'll
они
do it
сказали, что
soon.
сейчас передадут.
We'll do.
Ну, хорошо,
Oh,
сейчас
you see,
потом
they said
опять.
that
Ну,
we'll give the property
бег
soon.
по кругу.
And
Как
they
человек,
don't do
который
that.
занимался
This is a vicious
трансформацией Национального
circle.
банка,
Well, I was
я
dealing with the
как бы
transformation of the
абсолютно
national
открыт
bank. I'm totally
помочь
open
советами, как минимум, по
to
трансформации
help
фонда
advise
госимущества.
in the transformation of the
Я
state
могу привести
property
два
fund.
интересных таких
So
примера,
I
очень
can
простых.
name
Я помню
two
хорошо, когда
simple
мы
questions.
внутри Национального банка есть столовая, кто
I
знает.
do remember that there is a
кушал
dining
мне,
room in the
я
National
сказал, что мы
Bank.
не
Maybe you
хотим ею
ate
управлять,
there.
хотим отдать
And
ее
I
в
said we
аренду.
don't
Более
want to
того,
govern
кроме
it,
этого,
we
хотим
want to
поставить
rent
рядом
it.
эти
Moreover, we said that we wanted
взять ее на
to
аутсорсинг, чтобы другие
give
компании
it for
осуществляли нам
outsourcing
услуги
for other companies to
кухни.
provide us with
Поставить
the kitchen
эти
services.
вендинговые аппараты. Так вот,
And
для того, чтобы
to
это
set
сделать,
up
нужно было получить
vending
разрешение фонда госимущества.
devices.
Я не понимаю,
That's why
почему
we
вот в
needed
логике
to get even
жизни я не
permits
понимаю,
from the
почему я
state
должен получить
property
разрешение на
fund.
4
I
автомата,
don't
которые должен
understand
поставить,
why do I need to
разрешение
have a
фонда
permit of
госимущества,
the
и
state
если это
property fund to
написано в
set up
законе и так
vending
далее,
devices.
постарайтесь сделать все возможное, чтобы это убрать, это не
Well,
ваша
please,
функция.
this is not
Вторая
your
задача
function.
Это,
Try
Национальный
to
банк
это
abolish that.
аренда. Мы сейчас от приватизации
This is the
уходим. То, о
rent.
чем вы говорите, это аренда.
We are not speaking about
В
privatization, this
Национальном
is the
банке
rent.
были здания, от которых Национальный банк избавляется, хочет даже передать их другому государственному
So,
органу, которому это нужно, типа, условно говоря, судебной администрации.
For instance, since we still have the state property fund in all of the process, please focus upon your
Вы
main
немножечко о
task.
разных вещах
Don't
говорите.
do
Мы сейчас с вами
everything at
говорим об
once. You're
административной
speaking
функции.
about a bit
У Фонда
different
государственного
thing.
общества
We
Украины
are
есть
speaking about
дополнительные функции.
administrative
Введение
functions.
реестра
So
государственной
we are holding
собственности.
the
Так в чем есть
register.
мы? Какую
What
функцию нам
do we
повесили,
have to
такую
do
мы и
with that? We're
выполняем.
having
Боритесь
the
за то, чтобы
functions.
сфокусироваться на
Well, you
ключевом.
should fight not to have this function.
Каким образом? Давайте
How
до
can we do
смешного
that?
не опускать.
Well, this is ridiculous.
Это не смешно.
Тетяна,
This is not ridiculous. Tetiana, what do you think? Maybe I will try to be an intermediate between my colleagues. Vladyslav, why did you have the restructuring and the reforms of the National Bank? Because you had the
Который я
law
сам
of the
выписывал,
National Bank.
сидел и общался
Yes,
с
which I
депутатами
created
Государственной
with the colleagues myself. Yes, this is the root of all the evils, and we don't have the
Он есть, но он
law on
старый.
the state fund. Well, we have it, but it's obsolete. Yes, the
Я
one
не
which
про
would be
руководителя Фонда
correspondent.
госимущества, а про
I'm not
закон.
speaking about
Я
the
молодой.
state property fund head. I'm young. The law is old.
Я не знаю,
Володимир.
мені здається, що насправді ми
It seems
ховаємося
to me
за
that
законами,
we
за
are
якимись
hiding.
обмеженнями, знаходимо пояснення тому,
We are
чому-
finding
того,
explanations
чого ми не змогли зробити, розумієте?
of what has never been
Я
done.
впевнений, що Нацбанк дуже багато
I'm
робив
sure that
речей
the
для
National
того, щоб,
Bank
там, і там оптимізувати свої
has done a lot
ресурси,
to
так,
optimize
м'яко
its
кажучи.
resources,
Без закону, без
so-called.
якихось постанов і
Without
самі
the law,
приймали
without
рішення,
any
брали
decrees,
це,
they
там, на
took the
свою
decision and
відповідальність
took
і
it
рухали
for
вперед.
their responsibility and moved on. What I wanted to say, in fact, we should, well, I do hope that during this session we finally have a certain fundamental understanding what to do. What needs to be done, everybody knows, but in fact nothing is happening. So we do understand that the problem is that we have the public opinion shaping, which really scares off the decision makers, the people who have to take responsibility. That's why they don't do that. I'm not speaking about the possible vested interests, but I'm speaking about the problem of the group of interests which does not let them to work.
Що з ними робити?
So what should we do then? But there is a different issue, that we see new people at once, and it's like, I'm having 1.5 years.
Я в системе 15 лет,
Well,
я не
I'm in the
новый.
system for 15 years. I'm not a new person here. I'm not speaking about you only. I'm speaking overall about everyone. First of all, a certain period which gives an opportunity to implement the policy. This policy, before its implementation, has to be approved and probated how we do it in business. We have a business plan, we have the resources, and we have the monitoring of the execution of the tasks. A very precise monitoring from quarter to quarter with the reports, accountability, with deviations and new decisions, whether it's yes or no. Why can't we use the same business principles in the governance with the state? And we do it precisely to give an opportunity to form the policy, then to protect it, to give an opportunity to implement it. On the other hand, what I tried to say, people are afraid. Why? Because the National Bank or any other institution are living in a different paradigm. But they do believe that there are certain controlling agencies which maybe are not, have never changed their understanding. Since this is the issue, when we are speaking about 300 Spartans, the idea is a proper one. While we don't have this process of changes in all of the agencies, or at least in the majority of the critically important agencies, it won't be possible or maybe too hard to achieve the effect, because there are always people who are dragging behind, and everybody is looking at the weakest part. So really, we are now facing a substantial period when we should think on the fundamental components which need to be done. And after the elections, we need to take the short time for fundamental changes. During this short period of time, we should implement them without looking back to the political ratings and rankings. In spite of who's doing that, it can be done only in this way, with a big, massive team in the framework of the short period, with being sure that the right things should be done up till the end. I think that as a moderator, I should have an intermediate conclusion now, because we are now having the enterprises which are in the list of the banned for privatization. If we look at the portfolio of the enterprises which are state-owned. There are certain enterprises which cannot be privatized. So this is the question to the parliament, whether this list can be cancelled and we can have only a small list left. It shouldn't be cancelled, but still we should have the smaller list at least. When we have the smaller list, it will become bigger and bigger again, and then it will list even get bigger than we have it now. Okay, this list should be cancelled. Yes?
Добре, скасувати.
Okay, we should
Друга
cancel
частина
it.
цього
The second
портфелю
part
це
of this
те,
portfolio is that
що міг би приватизувати
what could be
фонд державного
privatized
майна,
by
але
the
не
state
може, тому
property
що не
fund, but
передають
it is
профільне
not done
міністерство.
because the line
Таких
ministries
підприємств
are not
теж
giving
досить
that.
багато. Вони
There are
не
lots
є
of those
забороненими до
enterprises. They are
приватизації,
not
але
banned
їх не
from
передано до фонду
privatization,
державного
but they're
майна.
not given to the state
Тут
property
питання
fund.
до уряду.
And then this is the question to the government.
Третя частина цього
The
портфелю це
third part of this
підприємства, які
portfolio are the
знаходяться у фонді
enterprises
державного
which are
майна і
in
можуть
the
бути
state property fund
приватизовані,
and
але
can
для
be
цього
privatized,
треба
but
реформувати фонд
for that we
державного
need to
майна,
reform the
сфокусувати
state
його
property
на
fund and to
ключових
focus it
задачах.
upon the
І
key
тут питання
tasks.
як до фонду, так і
And this is both the
до
question for the
парламенту в
fund
цій
and for the
ситуації.
parliament in this situation.
І є набагато
And
більш
we
широкий
have a much
контекст.
broader
Тобто
context.
Володимир сказав, що люди
Volodymyr
бояться.
has mentioned that
Віталій
people are afraid.
Іванович добре може
Vitaliy
розказати, як
can
люди бояться і чому.
how and
І
why
це
people
за
are
межами
afraid. And this
тих
is
речей, про
beyond
які ми
those
сьогодні
things we
говорили.
are
Тетяна
have
сказала
been
про
mentioning.
антимонопольне
Tetiana said about
законодавство.
the anti-monopoly
Є питання до
legislation.
судової системи,
There are certain
тому
questions
що
to the
угоди
court
можуть бути
system
розірвані.
because the
Тобто ми бачимо,
contracts
що ці
can be
питання є
cancelled.
ширшими. Це
And
приблизно
now those
відображає
are
стан
broader
нашої дискусії на
questions.
даний
This
момент.
is the state of
Добре,
our discussion
тоді,
for now, right?
Віталій
Then,
Іванович, ви.
Vitaliy, please.
Виталий Иванович, это мой зам, который курирует
Vitaliy
приватизацию,
is,
я
by the
Виталий
way, my
Николаевич.
deputy. And I am Vitaliy too.
Мы просто так часто общаемся
Yes,
вместе,
we're
да, что
communicating
у
together
нас просто
so
в фонде
often
есть
that
три Виталия.
we have
Виталий
three
Николаевич, как
Vitaliys
глава
in the
фонда,
fund,
Виталий
Vitaliy
Иванович,
as a
как
head, Vitaliy as
человек, отвечающий за
the
приватизацию, и
deputy
Виталий
who is
Людвигович, который
responsible for the
отвечает за аренду.
privatization, and the
Поэтому
third
три
Vitaliy who
богатыря.
is responsible for the rent. So we are those
Ну, теперь,
three
если
bogatirs.
серьезно о тех тезисах,
So,
которые
to speak
прозвучали, что
seriously
необходимо
about
делать,
those
как бы, там,
theses,
в
what's
дальнейшем, да,
needed
то
to
есть
be
необходимо
done,
ли вносить изменения
what
в
should be done
закон
further
про
on, whether we
государственное
should
имущество
have
Украины, да,
amendments to the
необходимо,
law
да.
on the state property.
Для того,
Yes,
чтобы,
the
опять же,
amendments
с
are
точки зрения
needed
приведения правил
to
игры, да, к
have those
какому-то
rules of
единому
the games
знаменателю,
under
чтобы уже было
one
понятно,
result
с
for
точки
us
зрения
to
того,
be
каким образом и
to
по каким
understand
правилам
how
работает
and
само
according to
государственное
which
учреждение.
rules the state institution is
Второй
working.
вопрос о том, что, ну,
Secondly,
еще раз подтвердим тезис, то есть продавать
we'll
и
again
продавать,
approve
однозначно
the thesis
продавать,
whether
но
should
оставляя
be
за
sold
собой
or not.
список, и маленький
Yes,
список
but
не
still,
может превратиться в
the small
большой,
list
это
will never
уже
transform
наговорки,
into the
потому
big
что если
ones.
в
Those
Раде
are
ставить
just
правильную
reproaches.
правильную
Because if
постановочную
we
задачу,
have the
по крайней
proper
мере, так как
task
мы
in the
проговаривали
parliament,
с
as it
Иванчуком,
was already
главой
mentioned
экономического
in
комитета, о том,
Mr.
что
Ivanchuk and
просто
his economic
нужно определить
committee,
критерии,
that we
по
just
которым
need to define the
мы
criteria
оставляем за
according to
государственную
which we
собственность, и
have the
потом уже
state-owned
вряд ли
property,
какая-либо
then
политический
not
сил
a
или
single
конкретные
political
депутаты, выходя
force
на
or any
трибуну, говорят, что
MPs
давайте туда вот
can say,
запишем еще
let
там
us
какое-нибудь
include
конярство
one
Украины,
more
это очень важно
enterprise
для
into this
страны.
list,
Да, то
because,
есть
for
вряд ли это
instance,
все
the
может
horse
быть.
industry is
Если мы
important for the
говорим
country.
уже о приватизации, что
If we speak about the
приватизировать,
privatization,
то
what
вот,
needs to be
например, те объекты,
privatized,
которые у
at
нас
least
есть
those
в фонде,
objects we
мы
are having
этим
in the
вопросом уже
fund,
занимаемся,
we
и
already
это
dealing with this
какая-то
issue,
краткосрочная
and this is a
перспектива
kind
по
of a
их
short-term
продаже,
perspective as
как
for their
большой, так и
sales,
малой
both bigger
приватизации.
and
Да, есть
smaller one.
разработанная вместе с
So we have
Минэкономикой
developed together with the Ministry of
программа
Economic
«Триаж», которая
Development the
делит
program of
общий государственный сектор
3H,
на
which divides
соответствующие
the
группы,
state
и в
sector
этом
into
секторе
the
есть
groups,
900
and this
предприятий,
sector
подлежащих целям
includes
приватизации.
900 enterprises
И
which have
60
to
из
be
этих
privatized.
из этого
60
списка
of
60
these
объектов, которые
list
подходят под критерии
are
большой
under the
приватизации,
criterion
все
of
остальное
huge
мало.
or big
Но есть еще
privatization, all
большая
the rest
группа,
is small
которая находится,
privatization, but still there
предприятий,
is a
которые
big
находятся
group
в
of the
списке
enterprises which are
объектов
in the
запрещенной
list of the
приватизации как
objects
отдельном
which are
законе.
banned for the
Я вот специально
privatization.
сделал для себя
I
такую
even have
выборку,
a
то есть
special
что мы можем
remark
из этого
here, the
списка
list,
вывести,
what
что,
can be
на мой
excluded
взгляд, не
out of this
обеспечит
list,
никакую
which does not
безопасность страны
guarantee
и может быть
security of the
реальными
state
продажами.
and
Да?
can
То
be a
есть
real
большая
sale.
корпорация,
For
там,
instance, we have a
Укрспирт,
big
у нас
corporation of
Укртурф,
Ukrainian
Укрбуд,
alcohol,
крупные компании,
Ukrainian
которые
turf,
мы можем
Ukrainian
вывести на
construction,
продажу и
Ukrbud.
получить
Those
максимальный
can be
экономический
huge
эффект.
companies which
А
can be
есть и другие
sold and we
предприятия,
can gain a
которые всю
maximum
жизнь,
economic effect.
десятилетиями
And there
находились
are
в этом
enterprises
списке.
which have been in this
Например,
list for dozens of years, for instance.
Киевский
Kyiv Mechanical
механосклад сандзаводской завод. Он уже
warehouse
даже вычеркнут
factory.
из реестра
It's not even
списков
in the list of
государственной
the
собственности, но
register of the
находится в этом
state-owned
законе.
property, but it's still in
Или
this law.
Песчанский карьер,
for
который
instance,
находится в банкротстве.
the
Или Шоштинский завод
bankruptcy
«Зирка», который
already,
находится уже в стадии ликвидации. То есть
factory
много предприятий, которые
which
находятся в
deals,
этом
with
списке,
sand pit
уже
or
скатываются
sand
к
quarry.
нулю.
Lots
И
of
чем дольше мы
enterprises
будем
have
держать
zero
эти
budget,
предприятия
or they have
в
already
этом
went through
списке,
the
чем
bankruptcy
больше мы будем
procedure.
позволять паразитировать на
So,
государственной
the more
собственности,
we're
тем
having
меньше
those
шансов у нас вообще
enterprises, the longer we
получить
have
хоть
those
какую-либо
enterprises in
пользу
the
от
list,
этих
the less
активов.
are the
И
chances to
возвращаясь
get
к
any
программе
profits
«Тряж»,
of
которую
those
я говорил
assets.
ранее,
So coming back to
разработанной
the
вместе с
process,
Министерством
to the program
экономики,
of
где
3H,
3,5
developed
тысячи
together with the
предприятий
Ministry of
поделены
Economic
подгруппам.
Development,
Так вот
where
там
we
самая
have
большая группа — это
3,5
1250
enterprises. The
предприятий,
biggest
которые
group is
подлежат целям ликвидации. То
1,250
есть государство
enterprises
Украины
which
их
have
уже
to be
потеряло
liquidated. The state of
навсегда.
Ukraine has
То есть не
already
потеряла за
lost them
последние там 2-3 года,
forever.
мы их теряли
Not just
весь этот
during the
период
2 or
времени.
3 years,
Это
but
уже
we were
факт,
losing them
который
for this
случился.
longer
Наша вся
period. This is
задача,
the fact already.
мобилизовав все
Our
абсолютно
task is
ресурсы,
to
абсолютно
mobilize
всех
all of
ветвей
the
власти и
resources
всех
of all of
организаций
the
для того,
authorities,
чтобы привести
branches,
к единому
to
знаменателю
have a
все
common
те государственные
understanding
активы
with all
вместе с
those
политикой, что с ними делать.
assets, with
Да?
the policy
И в
what
короткий
should be
период
done, and
времени,
during the
2-3
short period
года,
of time, in
принять
2 or 3
соответствующие
years, to
управленческие
take the
решения.
certain
А
governance
если возвращаемся к тезису,
decisions
что
or
такое
management
краткосрочная
decisions.
перспектива и
And
так
if
далее,
you
опять же,
ask
мое
me about the
частное мнение,
short-term
что этот срок не
perspective,
должен
I consider
превышать
that
10
this
лет.
term shouldn't be more than 10 years.
У нас есть вопрос из аудитории.
We have
Это
a
будет
question from
последний
the
вопрос,
people,
после которого я
from the audience, and
попрошу
this will be
спикеров
the last
высказаться
question,
коротко
after
по
which I'd like to
результатам
have the short
дискуссии, и
conclusions of
нам
all of
нужно
the
будет уже
speakers
заканчивать.
according to the results of
Yes, thank you. Hi,
this.
my name is Magnus Sherman. I'm from Real Research in London. I wanted to touch on Privatbank and the privatization of that bank, which is clearly going to be very important. And just take a step back to 2016 when Ukraine nationalized it and wiped out hundreds of millions of dollars of Eurobonds held by international investors. So my question to the advisors is how, in your view, has that affected investors' view on Ukraine and potentially, taking part in a reprivatization of Privatbank? And to the IMF, I wanted to ask what you were clearly very supportive of the takeover of Privatbank and cleaning that whole system. And now one of the issues is the outstanding Eurobonds, and the other one is claiming back money from the former shareholders. And the view from, or the line from Ukraine is pretty clear at this point, but will the IMF allow any sort of withdrawal from the current legal stance to get a deal done within the time frame that has been set? Thank you.
Do you mind if we only take the first question, because the second one is outside the scope of our conversation today, and you can ask that during your coffee break. Thank you. Rebwar.
I mean, I don't know the details of how the distribution and how the bonds were wiped out, but Ukraine is not the only situation where bonds do get a massive haircut. It happens in the US, it happens in Europe, so I wouldn't single out Ukraine. Bondholders know their risk. I'm sure there were distressed guys buying it at 10, 20 cents on the dollar, thinking that they will get a significant recovery. So unless there was something in that process that deprived the bondholders of certain rights, I would say it is part of the risk of investing in Ukraine, and it gets priced in. As Ukraine develops a much better credit quality, and they show a track record of being able to service their debt, obviously that cost of credit will go down over time. But I wouldn't single out one situation where there was a bond haircut as something detrimental to the, it's not a good sign, obviously it's not a good data point, but it's not the end of the story.
Thank you. We are approaching the end of the conversation, and I would allow a few words to Tetiana, Vlad, and Piotr to make the finishing, to make their remarks. Tetiana?
Well, as for the cancellation or the decrease of the list of the enterprises which shouldn't be privatized, banned from privatization, I heard the right phrase, that during this turbulence period where we are now at, I mean pre-electoral one, we can deal only with those visionary support or some of the exclusion of horse industry, for instance, out of this list. So if, for instance, the government gives such a suggestion, though I don't believe that they will do that. As for the precondition to change the program and to give this tranche. But secondly, even if the government gives such a suggestion to the parliament, you can imagine how it would give the ground for the political PR, populism for the certain political forces. So my forecasts as for the cancellation of this list, this or next year, are almost closer to zero. As for the problem that the ministries are not giving these or those enterprises and papers to the State Property Fund, I think that this is an important consequence of our today's discussion. It's important to ask about the reports of the State Property Fund had in front of the Parliament. There, you could inform us, as the representatives of the society and the whole society, what ministries and what enterprises are not given to you. And then I think that we would have the public opinion. Well, we have your colleagues from the Control Commission of Privatization. We always giving out this data. Well, you could devote that the part of the plenary meeting, for instance. And my closing remark as for the perception by the population of privatization, what we mentioned in the beginning, this list of the enterprises which shouldn't be privatized, this ban, it's similar to the moratorium for land sales. And as for that moratorium, there were held lots of research, and almost all of them were in fact having the same conclusion. Everything depends on how do you formulate the question. If the question is formulated, do you want your own land to be sold to the oligarchs? People are saying, of course, we don't want that to happen. But if you ask, would you like to govern your own property as the landlord? Of course, people are saying, yes, it's mine. I want to govern it on my own. Of course, this depends on the formulation.
Okay, final comment. To me, and maybe I'm provocative, privatization is just a tool. What is the most important is the purpose, why we are going for privatization. And looking at the energy industry itself, we were sitting closely to the Polish governments on the way, and every single step of privatization of the sector was driven or triggered by the energy policy of the country. In late 90s, when we realized that to grow economy, we need additional capacity in the system, and any single power plant was capable to invest into a new unit, and the government was not able to give additional funding to provide additional funding, we have identified few power plants which were decided to be sold. We were very selective looking at investors, we were very precise with our expectation. And every single privatization agreement was having two components: obligatory investment, what new unit would be constructed and when, and guarantee of employment, which was quite crucial those days. So it was the first phase. Then, with market development, we revised the strategy, we consolidated assets into the groups, leveraged distribution assets to go for the new investments. But it is always a plan. So privatization is not a transaction. You can sell it whenever you want. It is just a question of price. And of course, the incidence of different failed privatizations or the haircuts on the bonds will translate to the country risk. Still, it is just an action. You need to have a plan and to follow the plan. And it is not revenue, it is the most important factor. You may be having different options, different needs to support economy, to support the industry from different perspectives. Simply prepare the plan and follow the plan. We have been contracted to support privatization of Centrenergo, and we'll do all the best to make it happen. To me, privatization of Centrenergo is mainly about credibility. Credibility of Ukrainian economy and credibility of the whole transformation program. Is it the best unit or company to be sold in the first run? Well, it's a question mark. It was not my choice. But I believe it is the must to make things happen. And if we are successful with the first transaction, this will positively translate to the credibility of system, to the credibility of market, and then will rise the value of remaining assets. What you will do then, it's your choice. But start with energy strategy. It will help a lot.
Thank you. Vlad?
У меня четыре коротких комментария.
I've got four very short comments. First of all, I sincerely wish success to our advisors. I really do hope that their work will bring to huge results for the Ukraine, as well as all the other advisors who are working at other objects. We will show that even during those turbulent times and during political elections times, we are able to conduct efficient policy as for the governance of the public property and privatization. And of course, unfortunately, I agree with Tetiana that the next year will be complicated and it will become privatization more complicated, but we should do our best to go along this way. First of all, this is the work of the government and the work of the state property fund. The third thing, when it's very hard, I totally agree with one of the conclusions of this discussion that the problem of the whole perception in the population and paternalism in the heads of the people that the state should take care of everything, we should begin the huge communication program to take it away out of the people's minds. Not the state should take care, but we ourselves should do that. We should take responsibility ourselves. And the fourth point, one of the important points of this discussion, I would like to wish the head of the State Property Fund to become an example for all the rest during the next year and up to 10 years. We were speaking about for the people, for the presentees, for the experts who will applaud your work, even in spite of the population's opinion or some criticist's opinion, you will not maybe be the best. But the main thing is for you to efficiently govern the public property, which will not be that much in 10 years. Thank you. Thank you. And from my behalf, it seems to me it would be fair to make three conclusions out of this discussion. The first, the answer whether to sell or not. With big letters, yes, we should sell and everything. Vlad said about that in the beginning. Secondly,
наполнение бюджета не должно быть главной целью приватизации.
Shouldn't be the main
И третье,
aim of
даже
privatization. And the third
на фоне
point,
приближающихся
even
выборов
if the
у
elections are
нас
coming
замедляется
and we
движение,
have
то
the
все равно
slowing down
нужно,
of any movement,
нужно эти обороты
we
поддерживать и
still need
готовить
to support that
то, что
and to
озвучил
prepare
Владимир Владимирович,
what was
нужно
mentioned by
готовить базу для
Vladimir
того, чтобы
to
произвести
prepare the
фундаментальные
base
изменения сразу после
to
того, как
conduct
новая власть
fundamental
получит
changes
более длительный мандат.
instantly after the new
Всем
power is
спасибо,
elected.
и
Thank you
я
to
уверен, что
everyone, and I'm
дискуссию
sure
можно
that
продолжить
this
во время кофейного
discussion
перерыва.
can go on during the coffee break.
Спасибо.
Thank you.